Hey guys, how's it going? I'm back here with another video, and today this is like my first video where I actually appear in a long time because I don't actually have a camera, so I just borrowed this camera to make this video. But today I decided to make basically a video explaining how to make a GUI application using JavaScript. So since JavaScript is literally running the world, you can use JavaScript to do absolutely anything, then I thought it would be interesting to see how we actually can code something like an actual OS application using the JavaScript language, right? And we're going to be using Electron, which I guess many of you guys already know what it is, but basically it is a library which allows you to do exactly this, and it's really interesting. I've been coding in it, so this will be kind of like a tutorial on how to code a GUI application using Electron. So yeah, that's basically it. We're actually going to be building a password, like a password generator, the classic beginner project, right? So let's actually start. To create your first Electron project, the first thing you gotta do is actually create a folder. As you can see, we created one called JavaScript GUI, and you just have to open up a terminal inside of it. So over here, I opened up the terminal, and you can see that the only thing I need to do is actually just run yarn init. So if you're using npm, use npm init. Basically, you're creating a Node application. So Electron is a library which you install with Node. So in the whole application, you have access to all the APIs and libraries that exist within Node. So that's something that is extremely interesting. However, the front end, like all the visual stuff, will be coded purely in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So that's the interesting part. No need for like using weird libraries in Java or C++, and it's really interesting. You can just use everything you would use in a normal browser, but for a desktop application. So let's run this. You'll see that a bunch of questions appear. Press enter for all of them, and when it's done, you'll see that a package.json just appeared. So now what we have to do is actually just install Electron. So to install Electron, I'm gonna write yarn add Electron, but you can run npm install Electron too. It depends on which you're using. So when we run this, you'll see that it will start to generate everything. It actually takes a bit. I don't know if it's my Wi-Fi. My Wi-Fi is pretty bad, but it actually takes a bit to install everything. So I'll be back when it finishes. Actually, just installed. But yeah, okay. So let's continue. You can see Electron is installed in our package.json, and it's version 11.1.1. So compare to the version you're currently working. If there's any issues, maybe it's because of that. And one thing that we need to do now is basically normally by default, by like looking through all the documentation for Electron, usually they call the main file, the file which you have your entry point for your project, as main.js. So I usually call my files index.js, which is what by default appears here, but for some reason in all of the documentation and videos I watched on Electron, they call it main. So let's follow the standard. So to do that, you just have to change this to main.js, and we can create a file here, not a folder, a file called main.js, which is going to be the entry point to our application. And one last thing we have to do is we need to create a script, a very simple script tag over here, which is going to allow us to run our Electron application. And this is the last thing we have to do in order to set up everything for our application to run. So let's come over here and pass the script and just say that to start, when we run the command start, we want to run Electron and a dot, which basically means we want to run Electron to this directory. So just do this and it will work. Basically, when we run yarn start or npm start, it's going to run our application. So that's basically it. Let's save this. And now that we saved this, we now have our main.js, and we have to start building our actual application. So how do we actually do that? Well, the first thing we have to do is we need to import Electron into our project. So let's come over here and say const pass app browser window, and I'll explain what those mean, but browser window, and for now let's just write both of them, equals to require Electron. So Electron is a library, and inside of it, it's exporting two different variables or objects called app and browser window. There's a lot more, and we're going to be importing more in the next couple of minutes, but basically over here, these are the initial ones. These are what you need to actually set up your desktop application to open up. So basically, browser window will allow us to create an actual window. It's an object that generates a window in our screen so that it gives that feeling of an actual application. So what we're going to do is we're going to create here at the top a variable called win. Actually, we'll call it win. It's basically representing the window, but we can't call it window because window is already a property in JavaScript. So let's call it win, and let's initially set it equal to null, but we're going to change that right now. And basically, we're going to create a function called create window. So let's come over here and say create window. And this is going to be a function which basically just creates our window, like the name says. And inside of it, we're going to set up the win variable to be equal to a new browser window. So that's actually how you set up the window to appear. And inside of here, you can pass an object. And this object will contain all the properties that you might want to have in your window. For example, the width. So when you open up an application, you might want to set this as full screen or whatever you want. I'm going to set it equal to 800 for width. And let's set the height to be something like 600. And by the way, this is pixels, so keep that in mind. And then we have to pass a property called web preferences. And inside of here, we can pass all the preferences we want to include that we so that we have access to them on our front end, on our client side, or in our render file, which we're going to create later. So one thing that I want to have access to is node integration. So let's actually set that equal to true. And basically that means that we can have access to node functions and node APIs in our actual front end, right? Which isn't something that we can actually do if we're working in the web. So that's something important to understand. This is a cool thing that we can do with Electron. So we definitely want to make this equal to true. And one thing that I also want to make or put here is I want to make it resizable equal to false, because I don't want someone to constantly be changing the size like we can do here with VS Code. The reason for that is because it's going to be a small window and I don't really want to deal with that. So let's set resizable equal to false. And now what we can do is down here, right at the end of the create window function, we can say that we want the window to load a file. And what this method does is basically we can pass here an HTML file, and basically what it does is when the window is created, we want to load this HTML file, meaning that we're going to write all of our front-end code in HTML. So we're just loading this specific HTML file. So let's create our HTML file here. I'm going to call it index.html, and it's going to be actually the front end for our application. So let's just come over here and say that we want to load index.html, and now it knows that we want to render this page right here. So that's the first step. And now we just want to say that when our app it's ready to actually run, we want to call our create window function. Why? Because when you open up an application in your desktop, there's a lot of stuff that runs in the background, and you really just want to create the window when your project or when your application is ready to actually run. So Electron has a function which allows us to detect this by using the app that we imported here. We can say app.whenReady, and then .then, because it's a promise. So when it's ready, we want to just call the function create window, and it knows automatically that this is what it wants to do. So now that we have this done, we're completely ready to actually start our program. So let's try running it, right? So I'm going to clear here my terminal, and I'm going to run yarn start, because this is the command that we created. And when I click on this, you'll see that a beautiful window appears in my screen. You can see the title is JavaScript GUI because it's actually the title for our project, but we can change that later. And you can see that, I don't know if you guys can actually see it, but there's an Electron application that appears here, and it's 800 in width and 600 in height, and I can't resize it. If we change this over here to be resizable equal to true, for example, then we would be able to do this. I can run again, and you can see that I can actually resize my screen, and this is the basic idea, right? So I'm going to change it back to false. And now that we have our window, let's start building our actual UI. So currently we're just rendering our index.html. So let's actually start writing something in our index.html. So let's come over here and generate our actual file. So we can just put a question mark, at least in mine we can put an exclamation mark, and at least in mine we can put an exclamation mark, and when you press enter, it just creates the whole thing for you. So if you don't have that, I don't know if that's an extension that I downloaded a long time ago, but if you don't have that, just copy this. It's a standard HTML file, and what we want to do is we want to change the title first because we're going to build a password generator. So let's call it password generator. And then what we want to do is we want to start writing our body. So let's actually try to write something like hello world here. Let's see if that works. So let's save it. Let's run our project again. And when you can see that our title now is password generator and hello world appears here, similarly to how we would in a normal HTML file. So you can see this is the idea. This is how it works to work with a UI, but we're going to be working with a lot more than that. So let's start actually building our whole UI from this, right? So the only main, the main components that we're gonna have in our body or in our whole index.html is basically we're gonna have an h1 which says password generator so that we can have like a title. Then we're gonna have an input because for our password generator, I want to give the opportunity for the person to have like a keyword that they want to have in their password, right? So it's not only just a random string of letters and numbers. It might have, for example, a word that reminds them of the actual password. So let's call this keyword. It's an input called of type text, and let's give it a class name. So the class will be equal to keyword, and let's also give this a placeholder. So we're gonna say, I don't know, enter keyword ... and let's finish this. And then finally, the last thing we want to have is just a button. So it's just a button saying generate password. So let's save this, and now let's take a look at how it looks. So let me run my project again. You'll see that now we have a title, an input, and a button, right? But it's looking pretty bad. So what we want to do is actually just create a CSS file that is going to style everything. So yeah, we style our project using CSS, which is great because it's great for people who already are used to CSS. So let's create a file here called style.css, and we can just import this file in our index.html by coming over here to our head and just creating a link to our style sheet. So let me just say rel equal to style sheet, and then pass an href, which is going to be equal to style.css. And let's just close this, and now we have access to that CSS file. So what exactly do we want to write in our CSS file? We don't want to worry that much with like styling, but it is an important aspect of our project. So the first thing we want to do is we want to change the body. We want to make it so that the body has a display of flex, and we want to kind of like put everything right at the center of the screen. So let's come over here and say display equal to flex. Then let's align item center and justify content center. So if you've never, like whenever you're working with a div in CSS and you want to just put it completely centered vertically and horizontally, use display flex, align item center, and justify content center, because it will do that. So now what we want to do is we also want to change the flex direction to be equal to column, because if you remember, when our window opened, the button and the input were right next to each other. If we set the flex direction equal to column, they will be stacked on top of each other, which is kind of what I want. And then what we can do is basically we can just set the height equal to 100 VH, which basically means we want to take up like the whole screen, our whole window. And then just one thing that I want to do for the whole project, I want to change the font family, because initially it starts as Times New Roman, if I recall, but I want to turn everything into Arial. So if you want to use the same font, this is the font I'm going to be using, and I think it looks good. I love Arial, so I'm going to be using that. And now what we want to do is we just want to style our input. So to style the input, I'm going to just give it a width of 300 pixels, then a height of 40 pixels, then a border of none, because we want to remove the standard border that comes with an input. I forgot to put a T in the height, so let me just fix that. Okay, and I also want to give this a border radius of about 7 pixels. So we're not going to have a border, but our input will be kind of like, we'll have kind of a radius on its borders, and you'll see what that means. And then we just want to give it a background color, and the background color that I want to give, it's actually kind of a black but with some opacity. So to do that, we can just use RGBA, which allows us to put a color in RGB, and at the end we can put an alpha value for our opacity. So it's very simple. Black in RGB is just 0, 0, 0, and at the end we can put how much opacity we want. So I want it to be about 70% of the actual color. So we're gonna put 0.7 instead of 1, and then we want to give a color to our text inside of the input. I want to make it equal to white. And finally, the last two things is I want to increase the font size to be equal to something like 18 pixels. So 18 pixels. And then I just want to say padding left is equal to something like 10 pixels. Because initially, we're going to increase the size of our input. So I want to start a little bit to the right. And you'll see what that means. So let's actually run our project to see if it's working. So yarn start. And you can see that it works, right? Our input over here looks great. It's using Arial. Now we have a beautiful input over here. Our button still doesn't have any styling, which we're going to do right now. And it looks good in my opinion. I like this kind of input, right? And let's start actually working with our button. So the button will be very similar to the input. So to build the button, we're going to come over here and say button. And just copy some of the properties. So I'm going to copy the width. I'm going to copy actually almost everything. I'm just going to paste it over here. The width will be the same, but we're also going to add a margin over here because we want to separate it from the inputs. And the margin will be something like 20 pixels. And the idea is that we actually want to not have any opacity on the button. So I'm going to use normal hexadecimal here and just say that I want this to be 0 by using like to be black in my opinion actually. And you make this by just adding a bunch of zeros. I want the color to be white. I want everything here to be the same. I want to remove the padding left. We don't need this for the button. And I also want to have a cursor equal to pointer so that when we hover over our button, our cursor becomes a pointer. So let me run this and let's see how it looks. Yarn start. And you can see that it looks pretty nice in my opinion. We can actually increase the size of these buttons if we want to. I don't care that much. The styling isn't the most important part, but I think it looks okay for what our project will be. So let's actually, just the last thing, I'll just come over here and increase this to like 305 and just see if it looks better. And yeah, it looks okay. So this is actually our whole UI. The only thing we need is, like at the end, we'll have here at the bottom when we click generate password, a password will appear over here. But we're going to actually create that a little bit later after we actually start writing our logic for our like generating a random password, which is exactly what we're going to be doing right now. So to generate a random password, we actually have to write some logic in our main.js. And why are we going to do this? Why don't we just write into a script tag over here? Because I want to show you guys a very important topic in Electron, a very important feature in Electron, which is the IPC, which basically means that it's event driven. And you can create like send and emit certain events similar to how you can do in Node.js, and you have access to those events either in the front end or in the back end, which is extremely important and a really cool feature in Electron. So what does that mean exactly? Well, we're going to create here in our folder structure, we're going to create a file called render.js. And basically this is going to be a file that will have access in our index.html. It's a normal JavaScript file. You can access the buttons, you can access the inputs, everything related to the UI you can access in this render.js. And this is the kind of like the standard for an Electron project. You'll have a main.js which will contain all of the setup stuff and all of kind of the backend, and a render.js which will communicate with that backend file and also communicate with the client. So in order to create this render.js, we have to actually link it in our index.html. So I'll just come over here and say script. I'll create a script tag, and the src will be equal to render.js, as you can see. And we're going to close this. We'll have access to this render.js file. And also we want to pass here a defer property, which basically means that we want to wait our whole HTML to be done to then run our render.js file, to actually load our JavaScript file. So now that we connected our JavaScript file with our HTML, we can start writing code in this file. But here comes the hard part. How do we actually communicate? How do I grab whatever is in this input and grab the information that I got from this button and access it in our main.js, because it has no, it doesn't have any access to our actual front end. This is just a setup file. Well, this is where the IPC library comes in. We can create certain events in our project through this thing called IPC main. And there's two of them. There's IPC main and there's IPC renderer. And we use the main in the main file and we use the renderer in the render file, obviously. So what happens is similar to an event in Node, or if you've ever used sockets, an event that you emit with sockets, you can come over here and say, for example, IPC main.on, and you give a name to an event here, and whenever someone emits to this event, I'll call it event, for example, whenever someone either in the front end or in the back, either in the render or in the main emits to this event, whatever is over here will be run. So this is the idea, right? And why is this important? Well, because we're going to generate an event here called generate password, and basically it's just a function. It's going to take an event and it's going to take data. And basically, inside of here, we're going to write all the logic regarding creating the random password. And when I say data, I mean that this data right here will be basically sent from the front end, from the render.js, and it will contain the keyword that we passed in this input. So I hope this isn't confusing, but it's one of the fundamental parts of Electron. So whenever we emit a message to the generate password event, then this is going to run. So somewhere in our code, we have to actually emit this message, right? This event. So what happens is we're going to come here to our button, and whenever we click on this button, we're going to call a function called generate password. It's going to be a function in JavaScript, and let's create that actual function here in our render.js. So to create that function, we're going to come over here and just say const generate password, and it's going to be equal to just a function. And inside of here is where we're actually going to emit the generate password event. So in order to do that, we have to again import the IPC render property, the method that exists in Electron. So let's just come here and say IPC renderer equals to require. And we're going to require Electron, which is something that we can do because, again, it's all interconnected. We have access to Node in our front end. And we can just access the IPC renderer variable that exists in the Electron library. And now we created an instance of it. It's called IPC renderer. And we can use this to emit events that can be accessed in our main.js, which is perfect. So what is the event that we want to emit? We want to emit the generate password, and we want to send to this event our actual password, the keyword that someone wrote in this input. So let's do that. Let's come over here. Oh, I just copy and paste it incorrectly. So let's actually just say IPC renderer dot send. So to send an event, you can just say send, and we have to put here the same name that we put in the main.js. So generate password. And then here we can put whatever data that we want to send. So what is the data that we actually want to send? Well, we want to send the keyword. So let's come over here and try to send the keyword. You can see that the keyword will be inside of the input, will be the value of the input. So to access that, we can just say that we want to grab the element in the document that has a class keyword and grab its value. So let's come over here and say that for the data, we want to send document.querySelector and access the dot keyword class, and we want to grab the value. And now what this will do is it will send a request to the event generate password, and as the data is going to send whatever we wrote in our input. So now in our main.js, what we can do is we can just access this perfectly over here and write whatever code we want to write, or how we're actually going to generate our password through using that data that we received. So how are we actually going to generate that password? That's something important. Well, you don't really need to know exactly how this works because it's just for demonstration purposes, but you can easily generate a random string of letters and characters by using the math.random function, then converting it to base 36 and like substringing it to how many characters you want. And that's exactly what we're going to do. So we're going to create a variable called random password, and it's going to be equal to math.random. So we're going to generate a random number, and then we're going to convert that number to string in the base 36, as I mentioned. And now we just want to keep 3 characters. So the first character of this, the first 2 characters of this string will always be 0 and a dot, and you'll understand why if you try to run this. So we want to kind of skip that. So I'll just say substring from 2 to 5. So let's just keep like 5 characters. So this is the random thing. Our password will be our keyword plus 3 random letters or 4 random letters, right? And this is important because it will be the actual random thing that we're going to create. So how do we actually put our keyword here? Well, we want the keyword to be the first thing in the password, and you'll understand better. So actually it's not keyword, it's data. Whatever we write in that input will be accessed through the data. So we want our password to be like data plus the random strings of like the random letters, right? So the idea is that if I want my name Pedro to be in my password, then the random password will be something like Pedro 323HS2, something like that, right? So this is the idea. We grab the data from our front end, we append it to this math.random function over here, which generates a random password. And what we want to do now is we want to send back that random password that we just generated to our front end so that we can see it in our project. So how do we actually send data from our main.js file? This is another thing that is extremely important. Well, we can use the window function, the window variable that we created over here, and access a method called web contents that allow us to send information to our actual client. So let's access this variable called win, and we can access web contents. So web contents, and we can say .send, and this is how you actually send it. This is the standard way. You can put here an event similar to what you did with IPC renderer. You can't actually say IPC main.send. I don't know why they didn't do it this way, but to actually send and emit an event, you have to say win.webcontents.send. And we want to emit an event, and the event we want to emit is basically let's call it receive password. So basically, this means that when we generate the password, we want to send the random password to through an event called receive password, and in our front end, we're going to be listening to whenever we receive whenever an event through the receive password is emitted. So let's come over here and just send the random password, and in our render.js, we can very easily just come over here and say something like IPC renderer.on, and we can call the receive password event, and then just grab event and data like we did with our IPC main in the main.js. And inside of here, we can do whatever we want with the generated password. The generated password will come as in the format of data. This will be representing the generated password because we passed it in the send, as you can see right here. And what exactly do we want to do? Well, we want to just display it in our screen. For now, let's just alert the generated password. So let's alert data, right? Because the password will come through the data. And let's actually check to see if this is working. Let's run our program. I'll save this right here. You're in start. And you see that our program starts over here. I'm going to say that I want my keyword to be Pedro. And I want my password to be like Pedro and a bunch of random things. If I click on this button and this is working, what should happen is we should alert a message over here saying our password. So let's see. And as you can see, it worked. It gave us a random password called Pedro, then KHW5E. And if we keep like clicking on it, it will generate new passwords. So that's actually working. But what we want to do is we actually want to just display that as like a title, as a header over here at the bottom, and we want to actually display the password so that we can see it. In order to do that, we're going to create here in our index.html, we're going to create here a tag called h1. And for now, like initially it will be completely empty because we don't have a password, but we're going to give it an ID of password. And why are we doing this? Because when we receive a password in our render.js, we can just say that we want to grab the password tag, something like that, password tag, password element, whatever you want to call it. And we want to set it equal to document.querySelector, and we want to grab the element with the hashtag or the ID of password. And literally what we want to do is we just want to set the inner text of that element equal to the random password, which means that when we receive the random password, this over here will be populated with the password inside of it. So that's basically the idea, right? And let's check to see if it's working. Let's go over here and run yarn start. And you can see we have our password generator here. I'm going to write my password here, Pedro. And let's generate password. And as you can see, we have a beautiful password inside of here appearing, meaning that it's working, right? And let's actually just style it a bit just so that we can, so that it looks a little bit better. What we can do is just very simply come here to our style.css and just say something like password. And for the password, I just want to give it a font size. I want to make it larger, so let me say font size 35 pixels. And let's change the color to something like dark cyan. And now, if we run this, let's see how it looks. Yarn start, you can see we have our password generator. If I write something like, I want my password to have the word dog. Let's write dog. And when we click generate password, this is our password. I can generate again and again. I can keep generating random passwords and it will do it forever. I can change the word here to be, I don't know, Pedro again. And you can see our passwords are all being generated. And this is really interesting. I love working with Electron. This was the first time I actually worked with Electron, and I want to work more with it. I don't know what exactly I would build with Electron, because obviously in the enterprise level, probably they wouldn't use Electron to build a desktop app, just because it isn't as fast as if you would write it with a language like C++ or Java or C#. Obviously the C-based languages are always going to be faster than JavaScript or Python, but it's really interesting. And if you want to try it out, as I mentioned before, JavaScript is literally running the world. You can create websites, you can create servers, you can create APIs, you can create desktop apps, you can create actual apps that are native to both iOS and Android. So you can do literally everything with JavaScript. So if you want to learn this, I find it a really interesting skill. That there's definitely some jobs out there that require this skill, so I would really recommend learning it. So I really hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you want me to make more videos where I actually appear, just let me know in the comment down below. Tell me what you want to see next, because I'm posting every single day and I would really appreciate it. And yeah, really hope you guys enjoyed it, and I see you guys next time.